Today's cold case takes us all the way back to 1963, but this isn't just another cold case. This is personal. It's haunted my family for years. The questions, the suspicions, the whispers, they've never gone away. And the truth? It's still out there waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for joining me today as I dive into the investigation and confront the secrets that have been buried for far too long. This is Crimes with Catherine, and this is my family's untold story. Hey crime babes, welcome to my channel. I'm your host Catherine, and if you are listening to the podcast, thank you for tuning in as well. If you want to be a crime babe and never miss an episode, please remember to hit that subscribe button. Normally the cases I cover will be just one episode, but since I am related to the victim, I'm diving deeper into the details and have split this case into a 3-part series. I want to mention you can find a variety of photos and videos on my socials if you're interested in more content and a behind the scenes look, if you will, of my research process. This gruesome crime has followed my family for years and ultimately is the reason why I've started this true crime podcast and YouTube channel. I hope this episode brings fresh eyes to this case, and as always in all my cases, I want to honor the victim. The victim was 59-year-old Ruby Stapleton, my aunt on my mother's side. Although I never met my Aunt Ruby, I feel a deep connection to her story. Her unsolved mystery has been a huge topic of conversation in my family for as long as I can remember. But even though it was a frequent topic in my household, I never saw any media attention about this case. And many of you may be hearing this story for the first time. Not only have I started sharing my Aunt Ruby's story on various platforms, I have also written a book detailing her case. My book, titled The Washeteria Mystery, Who Killed Ruby, is available on Amazon. Now back then, laundromats were called washeterias, hence the reason for my book title. In my book, I included several items from the police files, including the autopsy report and shocking statements from witnesses. The most shocking statement of all was from her husband. I want to stress how detailed this book is. I do write a lot about my personal experience just hearing about this crime growing up, and then in the back of the book, after the picture section, you will find most of the statements copied exactly word for word from Ruby's case file, which I obtained through a FOIA request. And I will warn you, they are quite graphic in nature. Before we jump in today, I want to give a trigger warning, as today we will be discussing topics that are sensitive in nature, such as generalized trauma in losing a loved one to violence, description of my aunt's remains as they were found, topics on sexuality, grooming, and since this crime occurred in 1963, some of the police statements I cover include language and attitudes that may be offensive or harmful to marginalized communities. These topics can be deeply distressing for some, so please practice self-care when listening to this episode. Let's jump right into part 1 of the mysterious case of Ruby Stapleton. On October 8th, 1963, my Aunt Ruby was washing clothes at a laundromat in the small town of Searcy, Arkansas. When she didn't return home by a reasonable hour, her daughter Mary Claire, who was 20 years old at the time, called the police. The police did not find Ruby at the washeteria, but they did find her wet clothes in a dryer that she hadn't started yet. In fact, the coins were still in the slots of the dryer waiting to be started. It appeared Ruby had been abducted in the middle of switching her laundry. She was tragically found 11 days later. Her unclothed body had been thrown down a steep embankment of a dry riverbed about 12 miles from the washeteria. The manner of death was strangulation or suffocation. During the 11 days while searching for Ruby, the investigators were thrown into a frenzy after learning secrets about Ruby's husband, Ray Stapleton. These secrets created many different motives, and detectives had the confusing task of piecing this puzzle together. So who was Ruby Stapleton? Frances Ruby Lowry was born on February 27, 1904. She was known to everyone by her middle name of Ruby. She was raised in the small town of Davenport, Nebraska, with her 4 sisters and 1 brother. With her olive complexion, brown eyes, and raven-colored hair, she was a striking woman. Ruby's father was a preacher and editor for their local newspaper, and Ruby's mother was a school teacher. Ruby followed in her mother's footsteps and became an educator. At the time of her death, Ruby taught English at Harding College, now known as Harding University, there in Searcy. She had been teaching at Harding for over 30 years, having begun teaching in the 1920s while she was still a student herself at Harding. At 59, Ruby had 2 adult children and had recently become a grandmother for the second time. She liked to sing, bake pies, and go to church. In fact, her most burning passion was for her faith and her commitment commitment to Harding. She was the last person you would think a crime so heinous could happen to. I want to emphasize how important Harding was to Ruby and our family in general. Her father, who was my great-grandfather, helped start the college and was on the board of trustees for many years. My parents, grandparents, and many family members have attended Harding. And shout out to my nephew Reese, who is in his first year of Harding as of right now. Sorry, I'm just a really proud aunt. I personally did not attend Harding, but tried some other colleges for a hot minute and realized my passions were elsewhere. We don't all take the same path to success, now do we? So back when the college moved to Searcy from Morrilton, Arkansas, Ruby was instrumental in getting things ready for classes at the new campus. She even donated and moved the first printing press to the college. While attending Harding, Ruby met her husband, charismatic Emmett Ray Stapleton. Ray grew up in a small farming community in the small town of Wolf City, Texas. Although Ray and Ruby shared in the fact that they were both raised in small towns, they did have their stark differences, mainly because Ray was from the southern United States and Ruby was raised in the northern, more Midwestern region. If you know anything about the North and South, especially back then, you know that there were and are many differences between the two. Regarding personalities, Northerners are more likely to be straightforward and direct, with Southerners being more indirect, avoiding confrontation, putting great emphasis on politeness and hospitality. And as you will learn through this episode, Ray was definitely hospitable. Of course, those are just generalizations, but I wanted to point out these differences because I believe they played a part in the condition of their marriage. I've heard from family members that Ruby's side of the family had a very dry sense of humor. And if you were a Southerner, you may not know how to respond to that. Ray was a traditional Southerner with an outgoing personality. He was the ultimate charmer, and I think that is what attracted Ruby to him initially. I've had several people ask me after reading my book why she married Ray in the first place. She was loyal and kind, and Ray was just not that great of a partner to her. But while they did have their differences, they both had the common denominator of their religious faith. Somehow, Ray and Ruby made the perfect pairing at the time and played a huge part in making Harding what it is even today. So Ray was a professor of business at Harding and was referred to as Doc by his acquaintances. They raised their two children right on Harding campus in a modest home on Center Street. Center Street ran directly through the campus, and Ruby also owned homes and land adjacent to Harding University. At the time of the crime, their two children, 25-year-old Glenn Dewey and 20-year-old daughter Mary Claire, lived in Searcy. This is important to know. Ray Stapleton had moved away from Searcy about 10 years prior to Ruby's death. Over the course of those 10 years, he taught at various colleges around the U.S. His employment was short-lived at each college. The fact that Ray lived out of state didn't stop him from visiting, and vice versa. Most friends and family assumed Ruby didn't want to leave her alma mater, so she stayed in Searcy with the children while Ray chased his career. But in fact, there was a big secret not many people knew about Ray Stapleton. The secret would be considered very taboo for it being 1963. I'll reveal the secret in a bit, but for now, I want to talk about Ruby's last day. The day started out as a seemingly normal Tuesday. Ruby was spotted about 6:30 a.m. working in her flower beds. At 8:30, she had her hair styled at the local beauty salon before teaching her morning English classes. She had lunch at home with her daughter Mary Claire and her niece Clarita. Clarita had lived with her Aunt Ruby for about 2 years while completing her education at Harding and had grown quite close with her. This picture from about 1963 shows Clarita enjoying the infamous white swings on Harding's campus. The swings are still there, and every time I visit, I like to get a picture on the swings. The lunch was pleasant, with the girls commenting on how nice her hair looked that day. After lunch, the college girls went off to their classes, and Ruby finished teaching her classes that afternoon. Ruby was seen about 4:45 p.m. straightening up her desk and loading papers to grade into her car. Recently, I had a conversation about Ruby's last evening with Ruby's granddaughter, Heather Bates. Heather is Mary Claire's daughter. Mary Claire unfortunately passed away in 2018. Another reason why I'm so passionate about this story being put out there is to continue the pursuit of justice that Mary Claire so badly wanted for her mother. I want to give a quick thank you to Heather for being so open with me about such a delicate topic. I know it wasn't easy to bring up all these memories that her mother relayed to her, but Heather herself has been fighting for justice for many years now. She was instrumental in allowing Ruby's case file to be obtained. A little side story. Heather requested her grandmother Ruby's files in 2013, and the Arkansas State Police denied her access, stating the case was an open and active investigation. Heather did not accept that response because the case was over 50 years old, and obviously nothing was or is being done to solve this case. She took it all the way to the Arkansas Supreme Court, and she won, therefore opening the door for family to receive Ruby's case file. I'm very grateful for Heather's efforts. Heather shared with me that Mary Claire remembered that Ruby was acting a little bit off that night. Heather said she could see the look of torment in her mother's eyes when she recounted the last moment she saw her mother Ruby. It was the pivotal moment in which Heather realized just how traumatic this whole situation was for her mother, Mary Claire. I cannot imagine being a young college girl with your whole life ahead of you and suddenly losing your mother in such a mysterious and tragic way. That evening, before the Bible meeting, Mary Claire had gone into the kitchen to grab supper. She noticed Ruby had not fixed her anything to eat. And you know how mothers can be. I am guilty of this myself. Want to make sure your kids eat something even if they say they aren't hungry. It was odd to Mary Claire that her mom wasn't trying to force feed her before she left for the evening. In an excerpt from Ruby's case file, Mary Claire stated, "Mother also normally rushed around and fixed me something to eat when I was in a rush for classes or other activities. On this evening, when I entered the room, she was simply standing and looking out the window. This is something Mother very rarely or never did before. Mother is just like a fire engine going 90 to nothing all the time." End of excerpt. That is the perfect way to describe headstrong, driven Ruby. And this incident of Ruby staring out the window obviously rattled Mary Claire enough that she told police. I had the unique opportunity to also speak with Clarita about her memory of that day as well. Remember, she lived with Ruby while completing her Harding education. She was just a young college student when all of this happened. She is now in her 80s, but remembers things with stark accuracy. Her perception of that evening mirrored Mary Claire's. Clarita told me Ruby was peering outside through this narrow window, kind of hidden behind a piece of furniture. At the time, Clarita thought it was odd, and after the abduction, she was convinced Ruby was sensing something was about to happen. But what she was worried about is not definitively known. After the girls left, Ruby left around 7 p.m. to visit her son. Glenn Dewey lived in Searcy with his wife Patricia, Pat for short, and 2 young children. On her way to Glenn Dewey's, Ruby picked up Charlotte Rhodes, Pat's 14-year-old sister. Pat had a newborn son that was just a few weeks old, and I imagine Charlotte was going along to see her new baby nephew. Charlotte and Ruby arrived at Glenn Dewey's home around 7:40, where it was an uneventful evening, except Glenn Dewey's washing machine was not working. Ruby, Glenn Dewey, and Pat spent time in the carport standing near the clogged washer talking while Charlotte watched TV in the house. Charlotte told police she eventually wandered out to the carport where she heard Ruby say to Glenn Dewey she would bring his Levi's back that night or the next morning before work. I actually didn't know Levi's were even a thing back then, so I went down a rabbit hole of learning when Levi's were first made. I was surprised to find out they were founded in San Francisco in 1853. Recently, I noticed my daughters have been on the lookout for Levi 501 jean shorts, and I remember years ago loving and wearing the 501s. I actually think I have a couple pairs now, but when I was a teenager, I would borrow my dad's Levi's and turn them into shorts by cutting them and using a fork to shred the edges. My friends and I called this method forking the jeans. I don't know why, okay? It's a weird name, but we were completely innocent, and that's what it was called. It's true. True story. Okay. My daughters like to remind me I've told them my little Levi jeans story about 5 times. It's always lovely when your children can remind you of just how forgetful you can be. So Ruby was going to wash Glenn Dewey's Levi jeans and return them. Ruby also made plans for the following morning to drop Pat and the infant off at a doctor's appointment. While they were at the appointment, she was going to take the older child to buy him a new pair of shoes. That tells us how important her family was to her, and it also shows us that she was not planning on going anywhere. Charlotte and Ruby left Glenn Dewey's at 9 p.m. with soiled wash in tow. Ruby dropped Charlotte off, Charlotte not knowing that was the last time she was going to see her sister's sweet mother-in-law. I just want to mention a lot of the families in Searcy were intertwined through Harding connections, and the Rhodes and the Stapletons went back years. Ruby was well known and familiar to many families. She also kept up with her students after they graduated, with many of them coming back over the years just to visit. This crime sent shockwaves through the entire town and affected so many people's lives. After dropping Charlotte off, Ruby stopped to grab her own laundry. Clarita had arrived moments before and was standing outside when Ruby pulled up. Ruby commented to Clarita, "I don't want to wash the life out of my clothes, so I'm going to go to the laundromat by Harrison's Grocery. They have a 20-minute wash cycle." As I was putting this episode together, it kind of hit me that instead of the life being washed out of Ruby's clothes that night, Ruby's life was washed out. Just seems like an ironic set of words to use, and honestly, I felt this sense of foreboding all throughout this case. Clarita shared some something of importance that occurred just before Ruby returned to grab her laundry. She also shared it with law enforcement at the time. At about 9 p.m., Clarita and her boyfriend Jerry walked home together after their Bible study. Clarita dropped her sweater in a mud puddle, causing the muddy water to splash up onto her legs. There was nearby construction, and there was a lot of dirt. She emphasized the significance of telling me about dropping her sweater was that she did not go directly inside when she got to Ruby's house. Her boyfriend Jerry left, and as she was using the garden hose to clean off her legs and shoes, Clarita noticed a dark-colored car drive by very slowly, and then a minute later, it drove by slowly again. She thought it was unusual and felt a little uneasy. She stated to me, "Here I was, bending over, pulling up my skirt a little to rinse off, and when the car drove by so slowly, I thought, wow, you're really getting a good look, aren't you?" She later learned that friends on the other side of campus also reported seeing a dark car driving slowly through the campus at the same time. It was obviously circling the campus, and ironically, there was an eyewitness that saw a dark-colored car parked outside the Washeteria later that same night as well. Clarita believes the occupants of the car were looking for Ruby. She unfortunately didn't get a good look at the driver since she was preoccupied with rinsing off the mud, and she probably was focused on getting inside because she felt uneasy about the car driving by. A few minutes later is when Ruby arrived to grab her laundry. Ruby and Clarita went inside, Clarita not mentioning the car. Ruby asked Clarita if she wanted to go along to the Washeteria, but Clarita told me she had recently washed, so she didn't feel the need to go. That moment was the last time Clarita saw Ruby. She relayed to me that she has asked herself the question all these years what might have happened had she gone with Ruby that night. She believes that even if her presence deterred the perpetrator, he eventually would have found another opportunity to commit the crime. She is also wise in thinking that she herself could have been harmed. I just can't imagine living with the what-ifs and possible scenarios all these years and still not having answers. I want to add that Clarita emphatically believes that this crime was not random. I want to also express my appreciation for Clarita's willingness to open up to me and share her memories and the facts of this case with me. I really do appreciate her time she spent with me. We had so many phone calls, and if it weren't for her, I would not know key details of this case, and I am just very thankful. Ruby arrived at the Norge Laundroma around 10 p.m. and placed her soiled clothes and baskets on the floor. Before I get into the eyewitness accounts, I want to mention something about the name of the Washeteria, the Norge Laundroma. While I was completing this episode, I had a conversation with a woman who grew up in Searcy. She has a heightened interest in this case. She said she read and enjoyed my book, but wondered if I changed the name of the Washeteria. She remembered it being called Heggy's Washeteria, not the Norge Laundroma. She used to ride her tricycle around the washing machines that sat in a row down the middle of the building. In this drawing taken from the police files, you can see where they labeled washers down the middle and then the dryers lined up on the wall. I can imagine the little girl on her tricycle riding around these washing machines waiting for her mother's laundry to finish. And her father worked nearby at the Texaco station, so she was a frequent flyer at this Washeteria. In part 2, I go into more detail about this woman and what her connection is with my Aunt Ruby's case. You'll want to stay tuned because it is very interesting. Even though it is labeled as the Norge Laundroma throughout Ruby's police file, I'm wondering about the correct name. The file states that after Ruby placed her clothes on the floor, she spoke with the Washeteria's attendant, a Mrs. Reggie. I went back to the old faded file and looked closer at what I thought said Reggie. I think it actually says Heggy, so that makes perfect sense. You can see here in this picture of the faded report how I could mistake the H for an R, and I think I very likely did. I tried to find a picture of the Washeteria, but could only find this one printed in the newspaper at the time. As you can see, it is impossible to make much out of this darkened image from the library's microfilm. The Norge Laundromas online that I could find had a huge globe for a sign with polka dots, and they were technically named Norge Laundry and Cleaning Villages. The one in Searcy didn't seem to have the globe with the Norge balls, as some would call them. I found these retro advertisements for purchase online, and I also found a picture of this sign from the 60s that says Norge Equipped Laundromas. It makes me wonder if it was actually just a Norge Equipped Laundroma and the locals referred to it as Heggy's Washeteria. This picture shows Angels Market, formerly known as Harrison's, taken just a couple of years after the crime. Now, this was located directly adjacent to the Washeteria. It might be a stretch, but on the edge of the photo, I feel like I can see an O and an R, possibly spelling out Norge. In this image, you can see the empty parking lot that now stands where the Washeteria, Adams Pest Control, and Harrison's or Angels Market used to stand. Now, it's just a vacant lot there on the corner of Lincoln and Main in Searcy. My daughter and I captured some video footage of the empty lot, and you can see very distinct markings where I I believe the machines were bolted to the ground. It was somewhat emotional and rather eerie to be standing at the scene of the crime. This street is much busier now than back in 1963, but back then this street took you directly out of town and there was barely anything else around. I know that was a lot of information for such a minute detail about the Washeteria's name, but since this case is dear to my heart, I like all the little details. I am just intrigued about the correct name of this establishment. I would love to hear from you in the comments if any of you are Searcy natives and know anything about Miss Heggie's Washeteria. Does anyone remember it being called the Norge Laundroma? Let's get back to the timeline and events of that night. Around 11 o'clock, Mary Claire returned home from her Bible meeting and Clarita told her Ruby was gone doing laundry. As the evening got later and later, Mary Claire realized it was taking way too long for her mother to return. She tried to call the Washeteria but couldn't find the number. She ends up calling police and asking them to do a welfare check on her mother there at the Washeteria. Police go to the Washeteria and find Ruby's white 1961 Comet station wagon parked out front. They went inside, and that's when they saw the basket of clean clothes on the ground and the dryers with the coins in them. There was a half-used bottle of Whisk laundry detergent sitting on top of the counter as well. When policemen tell Mary Claire that they found her mother's car, but no Ruby, Mary Claire wanted to go to the Washeteria to see for herself. So Officer Dean Hunter picked up Mary Claire and drove her back to the Washeteria. When she saw that Ruby wasn't there, she asked to be driven to her brother Glenn Dewey's home immediately. The policeman dropped Mary Claire off at Glenn Dewey's and went back to do a more thorough search of the Washeteria. It took Glenn Dewey a few minutes to come to the door. He and his wife had obviously been fast asleep and could not imagine where Ruby would have been at that late hour. Mary Claire drove with Glenn Dewey and his family to the Rhodes home. Remember, that's Pat's family where Charlotte lives. They wondered if Ruby was over there for some reason. Obviously, she wasn't, and they decided to leave the older son with the mother-in-law, and they took the infant son to Ruby's home, where Clarita kept him while the trio went back to the Washeteria. They also grabbed a picture of Ruby to take to the Washeteria to give to the policeman. Clarita shared with me that when Officer Dean Hunter picked up Mary Claire to take her to the Washeteria, Clarita stayed back at the house hoping to hear something. She said she locked the door tight and was very afraid. Even early on in this situation, alarm bells were going off that something was not right. Glenn Dewey also called his father Ray at some point and alerted him to Ruby's disappearance. Ray was miles away in Superior, Wisconsin, where he had recently started employment at a college there. Investigators were eager to speak with Ray. The police and family eventually left the Washeteria that night, and things were stagnant at that point. The only evidence left behind was Ruby's car and a few items left inside the car, a dishpan, laundry soap, and papers to be graded. But her purse and keys were not found anywhere. I find it interesting that there didn't seem to be signs of a struggle in the Washeteria. I know there aren't usually too many items sitting around a laundromat, but you would think if there was a violent struggle, there might be a basket tipped over or laundry strewn about, but everything was left as if she just vanished. That makes me wonder if she knew her attacker or attackers. Maybe they tricked her into following them outside and then used force to take her. Ruby was seen by several people that night. She arrived at the Washeteria. She briefly spoke to the attendant, Mrs. Heggie, not Reggie. Later, Mrs. Heggie and her husband, who was an employee at Harrison's Grocery, walked by after they closed the grocery store. They stated Ruby didn't even look up to wave at them as they passed by because she was so focused on doing her laundry. At 10:30, the operator of the Searcy roller rink, a Mr. James William, also saw Ruby washing her clothes as he was driving home after closing his business. And then at 10:55, a Jack Gardner was picking up clothes from earlier in the day, and by that time, Ruby had disappeared, leaving her white station wagon parked out front. It is clear from these eyewitness accounts that Ruby was most likely abducted around 10:45. When policemen headed back to the Washeteria to complete a deeper, more thorough search, they discovered that 2 tire shops north of the Norge Laundroma had been broken into. At first, this seemed like a possible lead in Ruby's disappearance. They thought maybe she interrupted a crime in progress, but upon further investigation, they noted that barely anything was taken from the tire shops, and the entrances were not even visible from the Norge Laundroma. They come to the realization that a petty crime such as this would probably not produce something as heinous as kidnapping, and as they later find out, murder. Eventually, the police did apprehend 5 suspects who admitted to robbing the tire stores. They are labeled as youths in the police files, so I'm assuming they were teenagers. Now, I know polygraphs are not admissible in a court of law, but I want to mention that they took polygraphs and passed according to the polygrapher. The police were back at square one. By the way, there were a handful of interesting polygraphs in Ruby's police file that I include in my book, The Washeteria Mystery. Also, Ray Stapleton's polygraph was not in the file, and I'm not 100% sure if he took one. one. It seems like that I read that he was going to, but then someone told him not to, so there's just not one in the file. George Benson, the president of Harding at the time, was notified right away of Ruby's disappearance. He immediately went over to the Stapleton home and checked on Mary Claire and Clarita. George Benson and Ruby were especially close, and he was very concerned about the predictable professor. Remember, Ruby had been with the college from the very early days, and George Benson had also been the president since the late 1930s. Clarita had expressed her fear of staying alone at the house, and George Benson wanted someone to stay in the home with the girls for protection. So Jerry, Clarita's boyfriend, and his roommate Ralph McCluggage stayed in the downstairs bedroom, and the girls slept upstairs in Clarita's room. If you are a Searcy native or affiliated with the college, you might be interested to know that Ralph was a nephew or some relation to a man named Jimmy Allen. Jimmy Allen was a prominent former student at Harding and was a nationally known gospel advocate type preacher. Something interesting to me about Jimmy Allen is that his son Mike Allen is an author who is supposedly also writing a book about Ruby's case. I don't have any information on when it's going to be published, but I'm very curious as to what angle he is going to lead with and what the overall vibration of his book will feature. George Benson knew Ralph's family well and certainly trusted these young men with the girls that night. I share all that because Clarita told me when Ray arrived home the next day, he was adamant about the boys staying in the home, even though he was there. He raved about how nice they were to stay with the girls and that they could stay as long as they wanted. Like I said, Ray was hospitable. The boys did not stay. There was no reason to after Ray arrived. As night turned into morning, the community was learning very quickly of the professor's disappearance. My mother was 8 years old when her family received the news that Aunt Ruby was missing, and she remembers my grandmother hysterical with worry. My grandmother's mother was Ruth, Ruby's sister, and Ruth and Ruby had been very close before Ruth passed away some years before. My grandmother Helen lived with Ruby while she attended Harding, so this was obviously a very traumatic time for her. She didn't have her mother anymore, and Ruby was very special to her. Dr. Benson canceled classes to allow students to search for Ruby, and Harding offered a $1,000 reward for any information on Ruby's whereabouts. Community members and even the Civil Air Patrol were among those who also searched for Ruby. There was so many searching that police were getting calls from concerned citizens reporting suspicious people on their property. Policemen had to reassure the callers that they were volunteers looking for Ruby. I want to share this next bit of information with you that I received from a reader of my book just recently. In protecting their rights and privacy, I will not be using name. There was a man living in Searcy at the time of my aunt's disappearance, and when he heard about Ruby missing, he wanted to join in the search party. He lived near Maine and Lincoln, where the Washeteria was located, and although he did not know Ruby personally, he wanted to help. He was estranged from his wife, and back in those days, people did not get divorced very often. When he heard of Ruby's disappearance, he ran directly over to the home his wife was staying in to check on her before helping search. Remember, they were separated, but not planning on getting divorced. They eventually thought they would work through their problems and hopefully get back together. When he got to the house, he walked in on his wife with another man. That discovery led to him having reasonable grounds for divorce. He ended up marrying another woman, and they lived peacefully and happily for the next 30 years. This woman he married to this day still attributes my Aunt Ruby's disappearance as bringing her the man she was destined to marry. She believes he would have never caught on to his wife's cheating, therefore she never would have married him. I appreciate my readers who reach out to me with their fascinating stories such as this one. Ruby's case is intricately woven in so many people's lives of that time. Another story I want to share comes from Hannah Wood, currently the lead archivist at Harding's Brackett Library. She ended up being invaluable in my research. I'm very appreciative of Hannah's time and energy spent on helping me find pictures and articles about my aunt. I want to take a moment to also credit Harding University for providing many pictures for my research. Miss Wood shared with me an ironic connection she has to this case.
My father was a freshman in the fall of 1963, and one of the big memories he has from those early months he was on campus was when Miss Ruby went missing, and they closed campus down, stopped classes, and all of the students and faculty and staff went out into the surrounding area searching for her.
Did he go searching as well?
Yes, he did. Everyone knew who she was.
And I think it just really affected the student body.
It really did affect the student body because, I mean, it was a pretty small campus. Everybody knew everybody. And in a small town like Searcy, you wouldn't expect someone to disappear from the laundromat in the evening. I mean, this was the kind of town where you didn't lock your doors at night. And so, yeah, it was a big deal and definitely a huge impact on the whole campus.
It makes it even more real when I come across someone who has a personal knowledge or experience with this crime. So thank you again to Miss Wood and others for their willingness to provide me with such interesting pieces to this case. Once the search for Ruby came up empty, classes resumed and life had to keep moving forward for the frightened community. In talking to Searcy residents, I was told Halloween was canceled that year because everyone was in a state of fear, and that fear lasted for years. On October 9th, Ray Stapleton arrived on the scene. Ray was Ruby's husband of 28 years. Investigators checked his alibi, and he was teaching at the college there in Superior on October 8th. But even though he had a rock-solid alibi, did that mean he was innocent? Investigators asked him who he thought could have taken his wife, and he stated he had no idea, but gave police his opinion. The following portion is from Ray's exact statement from 1963. Please use discretion while listening to this next part. Terms and attitudes could be perceived as having racial undertones, and so just a word of caution before listening. The statement reads, "His only thought was abduction by transients, possibly Mexicans, who travel the area between Illinois and Texas." He elaborated on this theory by stating that his wife was very dark complexioned and had the appearance of being of Spanish descent. He remarked that his wife had lived a golden life, was very dedicated to the church and school, and had constantly worked toward a goal in her life. He denied when questioned that he was separated from his wife due to marital troubles, and was quick to express that he loved his wife very much, kept in very close contact with her and the family, and his only reason for working away from home was due to a disagreement with policy at Harding College. Stapleton then remarked that he was trying his best to bear up under his wife's disappearance and make the best of the situation because of his daughter's grief. Stapleton states that he wants to assure investigators of his complete cooperation in this matter, and at this point in the conversation, he began to sob and cry. After the tears were dried away, he made the remark that his wife was loved by everyone, and his only complaint ever was that she had lost her sense of value and appeared more dedicated to the church and school than to her home. At this point, there was a strong possibility that Ruby was the victim of a crime of opportunity. She had been alone in the Washeteria with the surrounding businesses closed, and someone driving by could have seen a chance to take advantage of her. Ray's statement was not all that suspicious. He seemed positive about his wife in this first statement, but as we know, things aren't always as they appear. At that point, the police wrapped up the interview and Ray went back to Ruby's home on Center Street. An hour later, an intriguing development occurred. This incident put a wrinkle in the investigation, creating more confusion. Ray received a call from two men who he claimed were demanding money for a ransom. The police traced the call to a payphone outside a drugstore in Lubbock, Texas, which is 10 hours away from Searcy. The police apprehended the men who were still on the phone to Ray and hauled them in for questioning. Their identities were discovered to be Carl Karash and Gray F. Chandler. Both men claimed they were acquaintances of Ray Stapleton and denied knowing that Ruby was missing. They told FBI agents they met Ray in the spring while hitchhiking when Ray was living in Boone, North Carolina. Ray confirmed to investigators that he did furnish these men with money and a place to stay. Investigators also learned his relationship with them was not all platonic. Karash and Chandler were charged with wire fraud, but eventually let go. Investigators never found evidence tying them to Ruby's disappearance. The detectives scratched their heads at what Ray shared with them next in his most colorful interview. Okay, crime babes, this concludes part 1. We've only scratched the surface of this mysterious case, so please join me for part 2, where I cover the dark secrets no one saw coming, secrets that some people would do anything to keep hidden. Thank you all for being here today, and feel free to drop a comment below on what you think of this case so far. I can't wait to hear from all of you. Until next time, crime babes, stay safe and stay well.